Welcome everyone to the NLI USA Signature Speaker Series. I'm Adina Canfield, the CEO of NLI USA. I'm delighted to welcome you to our talk today that will probe how ideas and broad societal changes percolate and distill and gel and ultimately emerge in our time. This is a special event brought to you together for the first time with the Sammy Prize Writers Showcase. The talk represents the public launch of a new association between the National Library of Israel and the Sammy Prize for Jewish Literature. We are absolutely thrilled to be working together to advance the literary field and to recognize the great Jewish authors of our day. As you enjoy the event, I invite you to think of questions and pose them in the chat function, and our speakers will address them at the end of the talk. Now I'm privileged to introduce to you Deborah Goldberg, the director of the Sammy Prize for Jewish Literature, who will introduce our speakers today. Deborah?
Thank you so much for the warm introduction and for your efforts in organizing today's event. The Sammy Prize for Jewish Literature is equally delighted to share the program with the National Library of Israel and NLI USA, of course. We hope that this will be the first of many joint ventures promoting the growth of a prolific Jewish literary culture. I'm confident that our work together will enrich the field of Jewish literature as we continue to honor the unique role of writers in the transmission of the Jewish experience. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our guest speakers. Dr. Raquel Ukeles is the head of collections at the National Library of Israel. She is responsible for the overall development of all the NLI collections and for digital, cultural, and educational initiatives based on the collections. She has published and taught on a wide array of subjects related to comparative Jewish and Islamic traditions, and more recently on historical currents that shape Israeli society. Gal Beckerman is the senior editor for books at The Atlantic. A former editor at the New York Times Book Review, he is the 2012 winner of the Sammy Prize for Jewish Literature for When They Come For Us, We'll Be Gone. His widely acclaimed book also won a National Jewish Book Award and was named a Best Book of the Year by The New Yorker and The Washington Post. Gal's most recent book, The Quiet Before, launched this year and is the inspiration for today's talk. With that, I give you Raquel and Gal.
Thank you so much, Deborah. Thank you, Adina. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. It's always thrilling to sit with people from across the world and to engage in conversation. I love this book, and anyone who appreciates the profound power of words, of texts, and anyone who struggles to understand the elusiveness of social change. When does it work? When does it not work? Anyone who loves text and thinks about these issues will want to read this book, The Quiet Before, on the Unexpected Origins of Radical Ideas. And so I'm delighted to be here with Gal Beckerman. And I'm looking forward to our conversation very much because I've been talking to you for the last few days in my head. What I would love to do with our time is I would love to start by asking you a few questions just to get some of the ideas out in the open, both about there are wonderful threads throughout this book. There are key ideas and also threads that you build through the cases, and also you've selected these cases very carefully. And for those of you who haven't had a chance yet to read this book, you'll find that Gal didn't go to obvious famous cases, especially at the beginning of the book. And I want to get back to your logic of the cases in a minute. So we'll start by talking a little bit about the context, the building blocks of the books, and that hopefully will serve as our building blocks for a conversation that I would love to have with you about some of the broader themes that I see in these books. You know, of course, the relationship between words, writing, text, and social change, historically, and even more so today. How does technology shape the way we think? You know, what is the impact of this bizarre new world that we have all come to experience, and we all see what's powerful and what's limited about it. And I think you really work through some of these issues, and I would love to keep talking about those issues. And my role here at the National Library leads me to ask the question about, in two ways. Number one is the two questions, and one is about where are the institutions in this work? What is the role of institution? Now, you touch a little bit about on what might be called the kind of godfather of this book, Saul Alinsky, and he mentions a little bit about institutions and people in institutions. So I want to come back to that. And what's the role of the library in this interface between text, ideas, and change? I personally have spent a lot of time thinking about this. And finally, here we are in the framework of the Sammy Rohr Prize and Jewish writing and Jewish ideas. And so I'd like to come back to this question of, is this a Jewish book? And what makes this a Jewish book? You know, of course, I immediately went to the second paragraph of the great prayer Aleinu, which is this notion of fixing the world is a profoundly Jewish idea, but the way in which the Aleinu prayer calls to action, perfecting the world, it's a universal call to action. And therein lies, of course, the tension between the particular universal, the Jewish universal, around all these ideas. Okay, so I've thrown out a lot of points and ideas. Why don't we start? Let's start back at the beginning, and that was if you could share with us what are the key ideas of the book that you've written.
Well, thank you so much, Raquel, and thank you to both the library and the Sammy Rohr Prize for holding this event. When you talk about institutions, there have been some very important institutions in my own life that have sort of allowed me to thrive as a writer. Sammy Rohr, the Sammy Rohr Prize is certainly one of them. And a lot of interesting observations you just made. I'm very keen to touch on all of them, especially this question of, is this a Jewish book? Because it's something that I've lately been trying to sort of wrap my mind around, and I think I have some answers to that. But in terms of what I was trying to do with this book, so I became, there's sort of two motivators, I could say, you know, that kind of coalesced at the same time about 10 years ago, actually, that sort of led me to begin pursuing this topic. The first was I had just emerged from working on a book about the Soviet Jewry movement, When They Come For Us, We'll Be Gone. And that book left me with sort of a profound interest in samizdat, samizdat being the underground writing that circulated among dissidents you know, during the Soviet era. This was a way they sort of kept their community together. And it seemed to be a particularly sustaining and powerful medium for them, in that it allowed a sort of a shadow civil society to exist inside of an authoritarian state. So I had that sort of interest in mind. At the same time, we're talking 2010, 2011, we're seeing this explosion of you know, what they were calling Twitter revolutions, you know, places around the world where social media was seen as this revolutionary medium that was going to allow groups of people to begin to make major changes in their societies, right? And that all you needed was the medium. All you needed was the internet and social media and platforms like Facebook or Twitter to make this happen. And it became almost immediately clear to me that these were actually very poor tools for doing the kind of long, sustaining, real change, you know, not just, you know, drawing immediate attention, drawing people to the streets. the kind of change that takes hard work, that involves changing laws, changing people's minds over a long period of time, that was something that was that a Facebook or a Twitter was not good for. So sort of these two ideas sort of converged, and I began to think about, what did other forms of communication look like for vanguards, for people who were wanting to bring a new radical, I use the word radical just in the sense of breaking with a social norm, breaking with a status quo, a radical idea into the world. What forms of communication actually allowed those processes to happen, where they could really incubate something that people had never thought about before, or that would, kind of solve an injustice in the world, or bring about sort of a better reality for a shared reality for people. And Samizdat certainly kind of stood for one example, but I began a sort of a historical exploration of the various forms of communication that kind of filled that role. And the book became, so the book just structurally became, the first half is this kind of historical tour through these different stories of when such small groups of people sort of had to come together and they needed a medium to bring them together. Letters before the scientific revolution is where it begins, but I go through a whole set of cases, would be sort of the academic way of putting it, but stories is how I like to think about it. That takes us all the way to the 90s and zines and third wave feminism, sort of the role that they played. So that's sort of and that left me, with a set of insights about what is an optimal sort of medium. What does it do? What does it provide? Does it allow for focus? Does it allow for a place for imagination, a place for debate, a place for people to sort of hammer out their ideas, to cohere ideologically? So from that, I was able to then look to the last 10, 15 years and some of the big movements that have caught our attention, from Arab Spring, through Black Lives Matter, Me Too, some of the really sort of headline making moments of the last 10, 15 years, and sort of understand them with this new, very long range historical lens, and see what was missing, what could have been done better in terms of allowing those movements to actually sustain and to make the changes that they really wanted to make.
Forgive me for this nerdy question, but as a historian, you said you started very far back in the past. From my perspective, you started pretty close.
Yeah. 17th century is not that long ago.
You started in the 1600s, and I was struck by your use of this pretty obscure first chapter. With a case I certainly have never heard of, and I'm guessing most people have never heard of. Why was it important to start with that case? And why didn't you start with the printing press or other more prominent
Right.
stories? Let me just add the parentheses, and again, to bring in the audience who might not have read the whole book. What I loved about the way you structured your cases is that you started with a set of what I would call esoteric or marginal or lesser known historical episodes, and then and kind of build up a set of lessons, if you will, so that when we got to Tahrir, which I think was the first case that anyone reading this book would know, it's like we were armed with tools already.
Yeah.
And then the last several chapters were all, again, not to be too American centered, but were all cases that one would assume that many, if not most of your readers would know would have read about already. Share the logic of that.
Well, first of all, I wanted to choose cases that would not necessarily be familiar. I have had people asking, why isn't there the American Revolution or the French Revolution? I'm like, because we have a lot of books on those topics and we sort of know about them. So I wanted to pick sort of cases that would feel a little bit sort of more sideways, that would kind of allow us insight into, the big movements that I cover in those chapters, from the beginning it's the scientific revolution, it's the right to vote, the universal suffrage, it's decolonialization and independence in Africa, it's fighting against the Soviet Union, it's these are the movements are known, but the particular angles on them are ones that I wanted to feel fresh. And so for that first chapter, just to give you sort of a thumbnail of what that was. I wanted to look at letters because letters seem to me an important innovation that matched the printing press. And here's where I do the distinction that was really interesting to me. The printing press was very important because it allowed sort of a one-to-many diffusion of information, right? It allowed somebody like Martin Luther to sort of make the Reformation happen because, through the pamphlets that he was spreading throughout Europe, his thoughts could enter the minds of other people. So that is revolutionary in a big way, right? Because people didn't have access to that. And in some ways, it's like the bullhorn that Twitter gives us, right? It's sort of more a technology or an innovation that's more akin to that, I would say. But then there's this other form of communication. This is the big distinction that the book is trying to draw, which is interaction, which is actual communication, which is, what I call in the book at some point, sort of, what comes from the friction of two minds, exchanging ideas, pushing each other. And that's not the printing press. That's something else. And it's letters in the 17th century and a very significant increase in the reliability of receiving letters and in their speed. So they could have a quality of conversation. It's a conversation in which you write 2,000 words and then somebody else writes 2,000 words, but still there's a volley there. There's a back and forth. And what happened in Europe at the time was something called the Republic of Letters, which was very significant in sort of leading to the Enlightenment, which was this group of men who were spread out all over Europe. There was maybe 200 or 300 of them, but they were beginning to carry out what we today would call science. They were doing objective sort of, or trying, to kind of eke out the principles of objectivity and scientific method on their own. And carrying out all kinds of experiments, astrological experiments, and looking at minerals, they really wanted to completely break open all the precepts that had been considered established truth, mostly by the church, by the Catholic Church. And so, and this work was to some extent subversive because they were questioning the doctrines of the church, like something like, where the Earth's place was in the universe, was something that they were completely trying to question and to come up with new ideas about. There were men like Galileo who did this by, writing a book and then getting in a lot of trouble and having to stand before the Inquisition and be put in house arrest. But these men were doing it in this kind of lower register, carrying out these experiments. And so the book, the chapter looks at one of these men, Peiresc, Nicolas Fabri de Peiresc, who was sort of a hub of a lot of these letters and back and forth, who had what seems to us sort of a trivial pursuit, which is he wanted to understand the correct size of the Mediterranean Sea. He had a sense that the maps that sailors were using were, 1,500 years old. They're from like the time of Ptolemy. And that they were wrong. And so he wanted to understand the correct longitude of the Mediterranean Sea. Latitude you could do more easily because you just had to measure the height of the noonday sun. You could do that with equipment that they had at the time. But for longitude, it was a logistical nightmare. Basically, you needed people spread out over different geographic locations as far wide as possible, all viewing the same celestial event on the same night, let's say, and then marking the difference in time when they saw it. And by sharing that information, the difference in time would indicate longitude. So this is easy today, of course, if we send a text, to 15 people. But with letters, it involved getting people from these various parts of the world to do this experiment that was still, like I said, kind of a dissident, subversive activity in its way, because they were questioning what was established knowledge and what the church had already sanctioned. And then on top of that, the people who he had to have participate in this experiment were mostly missionaries. They were mostly men of the cloth. They were religious men who we had to convince to think differently about their relationship to nature, to begin to see the world different. And so what I saw when I started opening up these letters, these back and forths where he's coordinating this massive, crowdsourced experiment, is he is moving these men. There was about 30 or 40 people, all the way from Syria to Quebec. Really, the entire known world participated in this. A known world from a European perspective, I should say, he's getting them to think like scientists. He's saying he's getting them, teaching them the value of a kind of meticulous observation, the sense that, they can produce knowledge with their own eyes. It's not just what the church tells you, but you can actually, if you do proper observation, we could come to some new truths. All of this was so new to them and dangerous, and the letters, because of the medium that letters were, I called that chapter patience. And the thinking was that there is a value inherent in, of patience, inherent in this kind of slow back and forth, slow building of accretion of knowledge, where you're pushing one another gently, letters kind of allow a kind of conversational tone, all of that was permitted by that medium. And it seemed to me such an important sort of value for the emergence of kind of a new way of looking at the world. Sorry, that was more than a thumbnail, but hopefully it gives you a taste of sort of what some of the individual chapters are like.
What I took from that chapter, and in what I earlier called lessons, but really a kind of the ingredients that I think you're lining up, is this idea that that there's a link between the medium. I mean, we say the medium and the message, but the medium here is letters, and built into letters is this interaction, right? But also there's this tension, I think, that runs throughout your book about to what degree is this about an individual who leads a process or a cohort, right? In this case, this is a guy who really, through patience and frustration, was trying to create this consortium that didn't work very well. Right. So the one ingredient is paying attention to the method of communication, the means of transmitting ideas, number one. Number two, the individual in the group. And number three, this trial and error that I think is a really really important element of it. Maybe it's a corollary of your strong call for time, right? Patience and time, which I hear as a kind of advocacy, especially if we, think about the end, this we're in this period of Twitter, and we talked earlier about TikTok. We're in this an era of lack of patience and a kind of return to what you get if you have patience. But patience goes hands in hand with accepting failure.
Yes.
And enabling this not to work, trying again, doing it, right? And then those become some of the ingredients that you then carry forward in your next examples.
No, that's absolutely correct. And I mean, I think another way of putting it is process. That this is a book that, and I don't know if I really appreciated fully how the extent to which this was true, but one review of the book, talked about me being sort of in love with process, and that we often, see these books that almost start, a book, especially about a movement or, that starts almost with the end goal achieved, and it's everything is a kind of foreordained conclusion. And I was really interested in the building blocks, what actually allows the kind of slow progression of changing of minds, of kind of added knowledge about a particular topic. And so yes, absolutely. The tension you described, this is kind of address another thing you said, tension you described is really interesting for me to think about, because in some ways the tension between sort of my narrative impulse, which was and here I'm sort of wearing a different hat. I'm not the philosopher talking about these topics, but somebody who wants to tell a good story. I really wanted the reader to have a character that they can follow. Each of these chapters are structured, with an arc and someone you're sort of following along. And that was, I think, in tension with the sense that I'm trying to get readers to emerge from these chapters with, which is, this is a communal activity. It is a group of people who is being sort of changed through the process of engaging with this medium. And just to pick up on a third thing you said, the medium is the message that, that of course comes from Marshall McLuhan. And this great insight, I think it's great. I mean, it's become a little bit dusty over time, but I actually think we need to sort of bring it back in a way. But it is the notion that whatever medium you use actually sets the boundaries for the type of thinking that can exist, as you're using that medium. So if we're using Twitter and Facebook, these are mediums that are privileging loud, fast, attention-getting, performative sorts of forms of speech, right? Like the whole objective there, the game is to gain followers. So your speech act is sort of directed towards that objective. Now that limits what kind of talk can happen on a Facebook or a Twitter, right? It's not a place for conversation. It's not a place for back and forth. It's not a place for nuance or for these other sort of features or for patience or for any of these other sort of qualities that I see in some of the other medium that pre-digital medium that I focus on. So I think one of the other objectives of this book was to sort of begin to make people aware by comparing, lining up, in each chapter, we're really focusing on a different medium, what sort of conversations are opened up, and what the character of the group is that's being lent, what the medium is lending to the group in terms of character because of what the medium itself is, and what's being foreclosed, what's being closed off, and what's not being allowed because the medium doesn't want it, doesn't allow it.
I really appreciated the unpacking of the relationship between the medium and the message, and the way in which each chapter plays with this theme and almost teases that apart. So, for example, in the chapter on Ghana in the 30s, that there's this newspaper, the Morning Post. I want to lay this out. I want to spend 2 minutes laying this out because I want to get back to Facebook in a minute. And that is, so you have these letters. Sorry, if you step back to the first chapter, and the letters are definitely interactive. Everyone can understand that. You do have a driver here. That's your hero of the chapter who's initiating this process, but it's definitely interactive. And then you have the medium of the newspaper, right? Now, the newspaper, one can look at it and say, that's not interactive necessarily, because that's, you have an editor, and especially in newspapers until recently, I don't, anyone who's done work on newspapers, that most newspapers historically were driven by one person or two people, and it was their mouthpiece, and it was a little bit like the bullhorn. But yet you show that in this case in Ghana in the 30s, it actually becomes a kind of public square, right? And so it's not, what I like about this is that you're problematizing this, this dusty relationship between the medium and the message, that it's not so clear how the medium can be used. It sets up certain, you talk about guardrails at some point in the one of the chapters, but it's not so simple, and it really encourages us to delve a little more deeply. And so if we get back to Facebook, I don't want to get too quickly to Facebook because it's very tempting to go there. But what I think has been so deceptive and problematic about Facebook is that people are attracted to Facebook because of this desire for connectedness. And for the desire to be social and to be engaged, right? I'm not alone. I have friends all over the world. It's a way for me to connect my family on the other side of the ocean. I can find people who share my interests. And in a way, Facebook could have functioned like a public square. But yet, when you scratch, you see it doesn't actually function that way. And so I guess what we're seeing is that the medium and the message go hand in hand, but not necessarily in such straightforward ways, I would say.
Yeah, and I think it is always sort of complicated to understand what function a particular medium is playing. It's so, in that Ghana example, yes, we would think of a newspaper in a certain way, but these newspapers functioned in different ways. They were actually almost entirely made up of contributions from readers, anonymous and pseudonymous contributions from readers.
Anonymous ones, right?
Anonymous ones. And so
politically,
they would be like some wire copy on the front page, and then the entire a newspaper was almost filled with something that was called Grumbler's Row, which is, the Jewish version would be like Kvetcher's Corner, and it's like, just where people were able to express in all kinds of new ways for them as being colonial subjects, express what they felt was wrong with their reality and British rule, and also begin to dream about what it would mean to be an independent people. They didn't have a space to do that. It was a critical public sphere for them, and that it gave them the opportunity to begin to sort of play out the conflicts even that would emerge between them. One of the big ones I mentioned in the chapter was, will we be monogamous or polygamous as a society, as a modern African society? We need to figure that question out, and they're doing it before they have independence, before there is a Ghana. It's Gold Coast at the time, entirely run by the British. So yes, I think that in that case, for sure, it complicates our idea of what a newspaper is and can do. And it does connect to this question of sort of what does it mean today to be social online, right? And your question about Facebook. And to me, the best way to kind of understand what's complicated about the social part of social media is through sort of a metaphor that always sort of makes sense, allows it all to make sense to me, which is that there are varied ways to be social, right? So there's that one model of social is like the cocktail party, right? And you're going to the cocktail party and there's lots of people there. It's really noisy. You kind of half hear everything. You have lots of conversations, but like they're kind of cut off halfway through. Somebody tells a joke on the other side of the room and everyone starts laughing, and you kind of turn in that direction. Glass breaks somewhere. It's you get home at the end of the night, you're taking your shoes off and you think, I didn't connect with anybody. I didn't have like a single real conversation, right? That's social, right? But it's a very particular kind of social that doesn't permit for, what I argue in this book is important, as we're sort of as a new idea is emerging, because there is another sort of social. 5 people huddling together in a corner or sitting around a table, sort of hammering out an idea, very focused, not being distracted, arguing with each other, agreeing with each other. That's also social, but the big, worry for me about our present moment and the way we use this technology online is this confusion where we think that, the way that we connect on Facebook or on Twitter or on these platforms is the only way to connect, that we forget that there are various flavors of social and that some are good. I'm not, this book is not a technophobic, let's shut down the internet. It's more, calling for what other people are calling for too. It's just a kind of self-awareness and a consciousness about what tools we're picking up and sort of what they're doing for us, what they're doing to us as we're using them. That if I think that to be social is just to be on Facebook or Twitter, that's molding my speech in a certain way, as opposed to if I'm communicating among 5 people in a quiet chat room where, we decide who gets in and we're talking about a very particular topic. That's molding my speech in a different sort of way.
Right. I think that in the case of Facebook, there's an illusion that something else is happening.
Right.
I don't know if people think it's the only thing that's happening or that's the only way to be social, but I think that the illusion happens and you express it so poignantly when it comes to Tahrir Square.
Yeah, well, I was about to mention Tahrir is almost a perfect example. Yeah,
it is. I mean, I actually lived in Cairo for a year. In 1993, 94, and I always felt very close and connected to Cairo. And I remember I was actually supposed to go to Cairo to the book fair, which ended up being canceled because it was right around January 25th. And I have always felt I still feel the wound in my heart for what went down there and this extraordinary cascade of hope and optimism. But as you point out, that isn't the same as the building of the coalition, of the discipline of the party. And when the illusion of social media distorts your understanding of reality, then the crash now in hindsight seems inevitable.
Right. Well, I mean, a lot of the sort of insights of the second part of the book came just from activists, from people who sort of experienced those sugar highs and then the crashes, and Tahrir is in many ways sort of the perfect cautionary tale, because I almost feel bad picking on it in a way, because the technology was so new and they were so excited there to have this means through which they could do this one really important task in a building, in making change, which is bring everybody out to the streets, right? They could do that extremely fast. They could do it at a scale that nobody could ever have imagined before. Certainly not, passing out pamphlets or word to word, and it achieved its initial goal, which is to bring down Mubarak, right? I mean, they could look at this tool, this bullhorn, and say, wow, we were given this opportunity to do something that we would have never been able to do before. Look how fast. It was like 18 days. Everyone came out to the square. It sort of sustained that. And we brought him down. We cut off his head. So, but then what happens the next day, right? The next day, you need to do harder work, which is actually build yourself. And this was a weird coalition that came together in Tahrir Square. It was not an all natural allies, and they had never had to do anything like grassroots kind of political organizing or anything. It all happened extremely fast. And so, the same tool that had helped them so distinctly in getting everyone out to the square was actually like exactly the wrong tool for building themselves into a true political opposition. They needed to figure out what the hell they wanted to achieve, how they were going to sell themselves to an Egyptian public that didn't really know what a liberal democratic political party, made up of the ethos of Tahrir Square could look like, or what it could offer them. They needed to do so much work, right? And instead they went to this medium. They kept going back to this medium that was all about sort of, tearing things down. I mean, it was very good at tearing down, Mubarak, and it did not have the functionality that they needed, as a place to sort of build things up. And this is, somebody like Wael Ghonim, I don't know if you remember the Google manager, who became sort of the face of the revolution. He left Egypt after the revolution and just became a Silicon Valley, like a skeptic of social media. After first saying social media is the thing that anybody needs to make a revolution, he then decided to, he went to Silicon Valley and tried to make some alternative platform that would sort of lead to more productive conversation, because he saw just how bad a role it played in the aftermath. And also, just the last point, against this sort of inability to cohere, inability to have the place for debate and patience and imagination, was the Muslim Brotherhood, who had spent 30 years in the underground, building these intricate network of cells, that had a hierarchical structure. They knew exactly what they would do if they ever got power. And then there's the army, which, was not giving up their power anytime easily. And, as we all know, it was just a matter of time before they kind of replaced the decapitated head of Mubarak with Sisi, so it was just, it was going to be a hard task in any case. But what certainly didn't help was that they had these tools that were the wrong tools. They should have.
They expected the tools for one function or purpose to serve them for another. Right.
Yeah, it doesn't. I want to repeat. It doesn't undermine the importance of the bullhorn. It's an incredible thing if you look over the long range of history, that any person has this power to project their voice, so much louder than they ever would have before. No doubt, that's an important development, in many ways. But my issue is that we've become too enamored with that as the only tool that we need. That the bullhorn sort of does everything. Yeah.
So I want to challenge you a little bit, and in this binary model that I think you lay out, and maybe I'm not understanding the whole picture, but it sounds a little bit like there's the bullhorn method, which is very effective, reaching a very large group of people. I want to even say a diverse group of people. And then throughout your book, you reference these kind of cells. If we use the Muslim Brotherhood model, and you talk about the well, you talk about the Charlottesville alt-right groups who were using these alternate platforms that enable this kind of quiet incubation process opportunity with a little bit of diversity in it, but really that model is for a pretty homogeneous group of people. And there's something that bothered me a little bit in the book, in that I understand the power of the cell, or the power of this closed, intimate conversation to work out problems and to think through issues. But I feel like that's not sufficient for social change, because in the end of the day, social change needs to happen by bringing different people to a table. And if I would just add in, you know, again, coming back to this question of what are the roles of institutions, and I'm biased here, but I've been working for one for the last 11 years, and I spent a lot of time thinking about what's the role of the library today? What's the role of the public institution in this world we're in? And that is, on the one hand, a library can be only seen as a kind of storehouse for the past, but libraries all over the world are trying to reinvent themselves to serve, to enter into this space. Like, where can there be a civic space or a public square that has a little bit of guardrails to enable different kinds of people to come together and to do all the work that you described so beautifully of testing out ideas, trial and error, honing arguments.
I agree completely with what you're saying. I think it's like the next book because I think these are two different things. You know, I think that there is a role for people who want to focus and to develop their ideas. They need to have a space to do that. And there has to be also an awareness of a public sphere in which these ideas can come into interesting interaction with each other. I don't think the one sort of undermines the need for the other. And in fact, I think partly my concern comes from, say, you know, when social media shapes how you as a movement, you as a small vanguard, think about what's needed in terms of how you present your ideas, you become reduced to just slogans. You know, you become reduced to just, you know, we need to do the thing as a group that will allow people to get the most heads turned towards our direction. And that to me is not productive. You know, it's productive in terms of going viral, you know, in terms of spreading a quick thing that kind of shoots into the bloodstream. But is it productive for a group who wants to then take their idea and engage with other people and sort of bring them along into a conversation? I don't think so. I think to me, it's too much like shouting. You know, it's too much like I've developed the quickest, pithiest, you know, most attention-grabbing way of saying. I mean, I can, you know, to give you a concrete example, you know, I spent a lot of time in the end of the book looking at Black Lives Matter, and I talked to a lot of activists, and they came to feel very conflicted about the slogan "Defund the Police," which is what a whole range of interesting thinking and you know, and really innovative sort of solutions about how to reform police at local levels was reduced to defund the police, which ended up being a slogan that, yeah, we all know it. It grabbed all of our attentions. You know, it really made us sort of shoot our heads up, and maybe, you know, made a lot of people retweet that hashtag. But what it did was it undermined a real conversation, a conversation that you could go to people who are not inclined towards that point of view and actually discuss with them, rather than shouting "defund the police" at them. You know, if you actually had a room to develop those ideas, and I'm telling you from talking to people that they're way more sophisticated than just defund the police. It's, you know, there are deep, really interesting questions about who should respond to a particular kind of crime. How do we diversify, like, the budget in a local city, so that all the money doesn't go to police department, but goes to, you know, social services, so that, you know, somebody who's acting, a homeless man who's acting erratically on the street, it's not the police who show up. I mean, there's a whole range of different sort of interesting questions that slogan, as attention grabbing as it was, sort of obfuscated. And so to your point, I think that in order to create a vibrant public sphere in which ideas do come into contact with each other, they have to be sort of, they have to be taken first out of this realm of this sped up, attention grabbing, space that we've all sort of, where those ideas are now being honed, as opposed to some quieter, patient, more thoughtful spaces where they are developed through deliberation.
So I want to take us in a few different directions. So I'm going to try to be a little self-disciplined and not scatter too much, but maybe I'll outline two. One direction is to go back to the power of the process that you identified as a key theme in this book. And when I first met you, my initial reaction when I said, this sounds like an academic research project or a scientific research project, that, what do you need to get to, nuance great ideas? You need a nurturing environment. You need a cadre of people who are all committed to the cause. You need trial and error. You need a safe space to try out new ideas. And so what's the difference between, should we all just be in universities or not? And I was very struck that throughout this whole process, there are very few academics milling around in this world. And I think that's a stinging indictment of academics today and the universities today, that they are not these places. And unfortunately, I think often they've gotten tripped up by the bullhorns and by the viral messaging and the slogans, as much as, maybe not as much as everyone else, but this vortex or this like whirlpool effect that you're describing about Facebook has had a very far reach, including into the laboratory and into the classroom. Yeah. And then I think about the getting back to this, is this a Jewish book? And the Jewish model, which I think is a very powerful model. It's not unique to Judaism, but the Jewish model of chavruta, of partner in deliberation and debate and sitting around a table, and whether it's setting a text or deliberating an issue. And what's different about the library, and the Beit Midrash, the Jewish study hall, is noise. And that the Jewish process is not a silent process, but it's not a republic of letters. It's a very noisy public square. And so is that an interesting model? If you were to, I've laid out a few, there's the university, the laboratory, the Beit Midrash, the Jewish, are these models that can, and how can we connect the dots?
Well, first of all, it's interesting to hear you say that the way that this sort of metabolism, that this kind of social media metabolism that I'm describing has affected institutions like, academia. I'd be very, I have that sense, but not being in academia, I don't know the degree to which that's true, but I think this book, I could have had an example from academia. I mean, that the first chapter and Puresque and those scientific, the Republic of Letters was essentially a pre-modern, scientific journal committee. Like they were vetting each other's ideas. So, I mean, I guess I would. The only thing I can really say about it is that I would hope that academia would be this kind of sanctuary where the sort of qualities that I'm describing, that are necessary for new ideas to emerge can exist, that there may be an island where they will always exist, no matter how crazy the rest of society gets. I mean, that's the ideal, right? Right. That's what it's supposed to be. I don't know the extent to which that's been sort of corrupted by people's. I imagine also money plays a big part, plays a big factor. Just being able to find,
outside influences, but also academics are humans on social media.
They want to grab attention too. They
need to grab attention also. But I mean, I don't want to veer too far in the other extreme. Of course, you know, I think that universities have an extraordinarily important role to play, and I think libraries have an extraordinarily important role to play to create these spaces with the guardrails. And I, you know, that's actually, I feel like we probably should move a little bit to other people's questions, not just mine. But I'm seeing that is popping up as a
yeah. Well, you know, just to give you just very, very quickly, you know, there is a chapter in the book, or late in the book, on about COVID and about this group of experts who discovered that on, you know, Twitter of all places, that their voices were really needed in the early days of COVID, because there wasn't a lot of, in the United States, there wasn't a lot of information happening, you know, coming from the government and from official sources. And so these epidemiologists, virologists, you know, experts, academics sort of became they suddenly gained, you know, hundreds of thousands of followers because people wanted to hear their point of view. But what was really interesting to me, and what I built the chapter around, was that even though they discovered, you know, the power of that bullhorn, they still almost immediately understood that what they needed alongside it was their own private, you know, DM, you know, direct message group of like 6 or 7 people. You know, most of them interdisciplinary, coming from different fields. There was, you know, in most cases, you had, you know, some kind of medical doctor, an epidemiologist, a virologist, you know, sharing ideas before they went out to the public. So in a way, they were sort of recreating that academic space where they could, you know, a lot of research, a lot of papers were being produced at very quick speed. And they wanted to know that they could talk amongst themselves. That's the key here. Talk amongst themselves before they went out to the wider public. They drafted tweets together. You know, they said, you know, or you know, I mean, just a banal example, but you know, there was like a study at some point that Motrin, the pain medicine, was potentially dangerous for people who had COVID, and they quickly kind of took apart that research and decided that they thought that it was wrong, and so they issued their. But they did it all privately. They did it in their group, and then they went out and they were able to sort of give their assessment on any number of questions, on masks, on, you know, all these issues. So to me, that's a perfect example of, you know, academics understanding the value of their closed spaces and their sort of the need to deliberate. Just to go, because I imagine we're bringing this full circle to you. I love the notion of thinking this is a Jewish book through, I have to say, honestly, that wasn't sort of front of mind as I was doing it, but, you know, in the way that our Jewish heads sometimes, you know, like lead us places that we don't even realize they're leading us to. It's absolutely true that, you know, and it's almost like a facile thing to say in some ways, but that this tradition of exchanging of ideas, of argumentation, of deliberation, of sitting around a table and, you know, being together and figuring something out, you know, taking wildly opposite points of view and sort of finding the consensus point. All of that is such a Jewish practice. I mean, it's if you look at a page of Talmud, it's what it is, right? So I think that, you know, subconsciously, you know, I was drawn to this idea. I actually end the book, you know, in the conclusion, I point to something that Hannah Arendt said, which I found extremely poignant and is very Jewish in its way. You know, her concern was for sort of a loss of a common world, a world that we all share in common, a set of concerns, a set of institutions, even just basically physical reality. She was writing in the 60s at the time of the space race and of automation, and she was really worried that we were losing something, and a sense of kind of a tangible reality. And the way that she explained this was through a metaphor. And the metaphor was, you know, let's say that there's 6 people sitting around a table, all being together, all having a conversation, all arguing, eating together, and suddenly the table disappears. And if when the table disappears, they're just 6 people like standing around sort of awkwardly without anything that's connecting them. And her point was to point to the table. You know, she wanted us to understand that we need these mediums of connection and bringing ourselves together. Maybe that's the Beit Midrash, you know, maybe it's letters, maybe it's newspapers, maybe it's these various forms of contact that allow people to kind of come together and shape the vision, a shared vision of reality that they want.
I agree. You know, in an Islamic tradition, it's a circle. They don't have a table, but they have a circle, and the circle is a very powerful mechanism as well, because you have to keep the circle closed, and you have to open the circle, close the circle, and so I think a lot of cultures understand what you have so eloquently identified, as this key ingredient of what is that framework. But I see our time is almost up, and I feel like I haven't been a great moderator, so let me ask you a few questions. It's just been too fun. Okay, so do you think that Facebook provides for better exchanges of, do you think that Facebook would provide for better exchanges of ideas if moderated better, as in within interest groups?
Yeah, I think what I'm proposing is not actually that radical. It's just that in that self-awareness, it's, if you have a group, if you have a group on Facebook that is fairly moderated, and you can decide who gets in, and you can decide sort of the subject matter, and that it stays focused, and that it's among a group of common interests. I think that's a great sort of other way to communicate. I think the thing one always has to be careful on something like Facebook is it is a private company that's interested in sort of keeping you on as long as possible, of sort of moving you from one thing to another so that it stays sticky, right? And so you always have to be aware of sort of how the algorithms that are at work on that platform are sort of, pushing you in certain ways. And also, I think there's something entirely detrimental to real conversation and deliberation in the like button, that to me, it pushes speech towards this sort of performative place where you're trying to sort of get people to look at you, as opposed to, I've seen forms of communication, digital forms of communication, that as soon as you take that away, that the impulse, the incentive for you as a participant is not let everybody turn towards me. It's how do I keep the conversation going? Like, what do I say that's going to lengthen the thread? What do I say? Can I say, oh, that's a really good idea. Here's something else that I was thinking about. Or, you're not just trying, it's not all about sort of you standing on a stage. It's about you in conversation with other people. So, I think being aware of all those various environmental features, that are part of the Facebook experience are important.
When you describe a better goal, if I can rephrase what you said in a more simple way, a better goal would be how to continue the conversation, as opposed to how to, these performative actions that impede the continuation of conversation. It really reminds me of a lot of the wonderful material we have in our collection. Where you see a conversation that goes on across ages. And one of the values that I have to say I never understood, when I was on one side of the aisles of being a user of libraries to now working at a library, is how powerful it is to come up in close contact with the original material and the original idea. And one of the special elements that you see when you actually look at a manuscript, or you look at an archive of a writer or thinker, a few hundred years ago, is that you see that, even before Facebook and before the digital age, they were in constant conversation. Some of my favorite materials is actually this collection of Islamic manuscripts from Dagestan and the Caucasus, because it's like they had that original manuscript, and then they were bursting out of the seams because they were commenting and revising and continuing the conversation, so much so that they filled in all the margins. They put what we would call Post-it notes, like these really funny shaped pieces of paper that they must have found, and they scribbled on all sides of them, and then they had to add more of them. And so you see that, instead of this being, that was then, this is now. Today we're dynamic. Today we're interactive. Back then it was, frontal. That's not at all the case. And that's why, again, like, to be in contact with this, all these media that you describe, it problematizes how they function. And that's also true for archives and for manuscripts.
Yeah. No, and I mean, look, another sort of job that I wanted the book to do is to break through some of the amnesia that we have, that, there was anything before the internet, in terms of just interactive communication. There's so many different analog ways that people actually interacted, that was always sort of a function of various forms of communication.
So I think there are many wonderful questions here, and I'm sorry I'm not going to get through all of them, but there's one in particular that I really liked, that I'm curious to hear how you answer, and that is your book ultimately a radical book or a conservative one? Are the ideas behind your book moving towards radicalism, or are you putting forth a conservative idea?
It's a very interesting question. I mean, I have to break it down sort of and think about it as I'm talking, but it's my notion of radical here. I think there's sometimes a misconception about sort of radical always means something left, or but I'm really thinking in terms of ideas that break through common accepted realities. So getting rid of slavery when slavery is all your society knows, that to me is radical. Giving women the right to vote, that to me is a radical idea when it first emerges. So that is how I'm thinking of radical, and so that can absolutely be used towards a fascist idea. It can apply to and I have examples in the book. I have I talk about the futurists in the 19 teens and how they were using manifestos to bring about war and fascism and anti-democracy. So the medium itself is a tool, and it's a tool that can be used for good or evil, if we want to put it in such extreme terms. So my focus here is not really to sort of elevate one side or the other, so to speak, as much as to say that we need to be aware of the role that tools have in bringing about these different sorts of reality. But I think there's another interpretation of the question, which is, it is a fundamentally maybe conservative way of thinking about things to say we need to all sit around a table and have a good conversation, and that we've sort of lost something in society when we've forgotten how to do that. And I'll take it. I think that's probably true. It probably comes from sort of a natural inclination, a personal inclination to worry about the things that get lost sort of as time moves forward, and the sense that there are things worth keeping, even if they're worth keeping in different forms. I'm not arguing that we should unplug the internet. I don't think it's possible, and I don't think that it's desirable even. But is there a way that we can find again some of those qualities of deliberation, deep conversation, of deep connection online? Yeah, I mean those
trial and error.
I have sort of a hinge chapter in the book called Cyberspace, where I look at some of the romantic early ideas of what the internet was supposed to be, and it was definitely supposed to have that quality to it, of being a place of lots of tables, where people could come together, of common interests, and it got taken over by commercial interests, obviously, and turned into something else that we call social, but has a lot of kind of detrimental aspects to actual sociability, But yeah, so it's so I want to say yes and or yes but to that question. I think it's an interesting way of thinking about it, but I will be very happy if the book sort of doesn't fall into any one of those categories and falls into all of them at the same time.
And with that, I want to thank you so much, Gal. This has been really fun. And here's the book that we've only scratched the surface of it. So I think there's a lot of rich, problematic, not, I loved how you said, if we can, I think part of the call in this book is to not slip into the narrow, the simplistic, to try to think, to join at the table. So I invite all of you to come visit us at the National Library of Israel. In the coming months, we are going to be opening a gorgeous new facility that is completely built based on these principles of engagement inviting everyone in all their great diversity to come and to sit around the table and to hash out ideas and to be in conversations with great texts from 1,000+ years. And Gal, we welcome, we'd love to have you come to the library in Jerusalem and continue this conversation. I think I passed it back to Adina to close.
Great. Thank you, Gal and Raquel, for such a stimulating discussion, for joining our medium of the National Library of Israel and our place of social gathering for the library. And Deborah, thank you for your partnership. Thank you all for joining. Thank you for being a part of the library's community and helping us incubate ideas here. Thank you all.
I'm turning the microphones on, so if anybody would like to comment or ask any further questions or just say hi.
Thank you so much. That was a fabulous, fabulous discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
You know, Gal, is that maybe it's radical to be conservative? Like when you said I'm conservative, maybe to say we really need that is a radical idea.
It might be at this point, yes.
Right? That's really sensational. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. Be well.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.